It's dopamine versus dopamine. This phrase has repeated itself in my mind for maybe 25 to, let's say, 30 or 35 times, maybe even 50 times in the last couple of days. It stems from Daniel Z. Lieberman's The Dopamine, the Molecule of More, which I now have listened to twice, because, well, more was needed after the first time. Now, I wanna basically note a few things on this here. First of all, it seems to be that the title of this book might rather be, or here is a suggestion for the future title of the same book, maybe not the molecule of more, but the molecule of the future, or the molecule of better, or the molecule of improvement. Now, the molecule of more is quite short, but I think it lacks the dimension, or it lacks the idea that some things might not have an optimum, which is basically in maxing out a thing. So things are not always basically optimized with maxing them. So one could also have minimizing functions, for example, such as minimizing pain, which then in terms of the molecule of more does not make that much sense. But of course pain now is not necessarily portrayed in terms of dopamine. Now, it's dopamine versus dopamine. So if I understand this correctly, the only kind of way to counteract a dopamine source would be to have a dopamine source that is even better. And so one might already have heard about things like if you want to quit X and X, then you need to replace it with something that is even better. And so now there is basically, it seems to be the case, if I understand this correctly, that there is basically a dopamine control circuit that basically seems to counteract the more short-term dopamine, again, if I understand this correctly, with longer-term dopamine. So this is now the first thought and the first of many thoughts now I will just list, because there is not necessarily a big connection between the different thoughts. Food and dopamine. In the last years I tried avoiding sugar entirely, and whenever I did this I noticed that first of all I can hold my body composition much easier, and second of all I actually enjoy quite the normal food that I eat, so the normal food actually tastes great. I think this is due to a variety of reasons. One of them might be it's dopamine versus dopamine. So basically the life I currently have with a body composition that is at least not very worse compared to before might be basically a mid to long-term lasting dopamine cycle, one could say, whereas the other ones might be more on the shorter term side. So basically the only way to counteract the short-term dopamine pleasure I would get from sugar, for example, would be to have a longer-term plan. So dopamine also seems to be not necessarily, as I already described, the molecule of more, but the molecule of making plans for a better future. So if one now assumes dopamine is the molecule of tomorrow, then the thing that basically maximizes the resources the most is to have it's not maybe this one thing, but one of the things that would maximize the resources tomorrow, or to have a better life tomorrow, would be to have a model for what is currently happening and to try to predict what will be happening. So the better this model is, the better therefore the understanding of the future, and the better therefore the use of the current resources one might already have. It's dopamine versus dopamine. In the last years, what became clear to me is that I usually have to try to avoid social media as good as I can. And the same would be true also for kind of other forms, not necessarily of social media, but of basically lower bandwidth human communication that to a certain extent seems to be able to replace the need for actual human conversation, but the actual human conversation or communication seems to be way more effective at giving me actually what the social need is I have. So the more I replace, let's say, face-to-face communication I otherwise would have at basically the same time, let's just say talking a few minutes to somebody versus chatting a few minutes with somebody, then the one kind of seems to deplete my motivation, whereas the other one seems to maybe increase my motivation even, and basically in the moment, but also in the mid, maybe even the long term, seems to basically make me happier. Not necessarily happier, but this feeling that there might be a future that is actually better, which might not necessarily be happy, and happy might also be just a word that is too simplistic to describe the different kinds of situations the general term happiness maybe convolutes. So in other languages there are also many different descriptions for being happy, and so maybe just this discussion about are you happy is just something that eventually has. I'm searching for an English phrase right now, but I cannot find one. So, what does dopamine think like? So if one thinks that now the underlying architecture of maybe a mind, like the human mind, would be that there are different systems which then drive different, or which incentivize different kind of patterns of thought, different thoughts, maybe entirely, then one could ask the question, what thought, or what sentence, for example, would represent a certain system quite well. So one suggestion maybe for dopamine would be, but what if? So this idea, yeah, but what if? Not necessarily yeah. It's just the what if, what if I did this, and what if I did this, and what if I would be able to do this? One could also say that maybe there are phrases and idioms which kind of just describe how dopamine usually works. So I think I heard Andrew Huberman in a podcast talk about the Cookie Monster from Sesame Street, and basically say that's the character is kind of based on the dopamine system or something like this. A great distinction that is also made in the book, and I also want to say that whatever I am saying now is not necessarily attributed to Daniel Z. Lieberman. It is just my interpretation of what I read. So not to falsely attribute anything and taking it out of context. Nonetheless, what seems to be, to me, the case after reading or listening to this book rather, is that there are these two systems. So the first of all, there is basically this one spectrum, and this is of course now maybe one of many others, and maybe an oversimplification, but there seem to be on the one side the H and N molecules, or not necessarily the molecules, let's just call them systems. So the H and N system is the here and now system. So it basically makes you appreciate what is here and what is now, and the opposing system, or to a certain extent maybe opposed system, is then let's not focus on now, but let's focus on the future. Another distinction Daniel Z. Lieberman makes in his book is that if you look down, you are basically H and N driven, or you basically, it's basically an H and N vision, one could say. But if you look up, it is kind of the future thinking, which then would be the dopamine thinking. So kind of in the beginning of the book, he describes that if you want to feel dopamine, or if you want to feel what dopamine feels like, look up. So there are these oversimplifications, maybe there are oversimplifications, maybe it seems, so the book seems to catch these things quite well. I don't know how well it actually catches these things, and how many other variables there are which are basically not included, and therefore it might be an oversimplification, but it at least is a book that is very memorable, and therefore it kind of stuck in my mind. It's this phrase that I mentioned already in the beginning. It's dopamine versus dopamine. It appears in my mind again and again and again and again. Also, the author of the book, so Daniel Z. Lieberman, I saw an interview or a few interviews of him, and then the speaker of the book also kind of speak quite similarly. And so this is maybe also part of the reason why this book seems to be so memorable. One other thought I had is to which extent I, in my own life, and also what my role in my life and also my body is, and to which extent I also identify with dopamine. In the book, the author says also that most people identify basically with the dopamine drive, and so they think that the thing that makes constantly or tries to make their own lives, but maybe also the lives of others better, so basically is working towards a better future, that they mostly identify with this, and not so much with the lazy couch potato on the other side, which is not mentioned in the book, which is just an add-on by me. So I also would say, and I often have been thinking this, that I would like to identify at least, if I could choose, what version of myself would I want to identify with. It's not the version that does not want to go to a workout, that does not want to stand up in the morning, that does want to just fall onto the floor because I'm so weak physically. And so the version of myself that I like to identify with is the strong version of myself, the version that is like, okay, but what if this, and what if this, and what if this, and what if this? But maybe also to a certain extent the version that can say, okay, this is useful now, but what would be even more useful, so it's dopamine versus dopamine. But then, so I seem to have kind of two drives, and this is now maybe also oversimplified, but the one drive is the what if this, and what if this, and what if this. So basically maybe almost on the side of too many things that I would like to execute, but I cannot execute them all. And so this might also be maybe a kind of a downside of maybe being too high in the dopamine circuits and in how present they are, and how much basically, or how the ratio between H and N and also the dopamine circuits or systems running basically are or is. And on the other side, there seems to be this other drive, and this other drive is mostly a drive of fear, a drive of pain, one could also say. The fear of what if I don't do this, then the future might look like this. And so the one is kind of the positive drive, and I can run on this for sometimes minutes to days, weeks, sometimes months, without many very big interruptions, I would say. So without many days where I have been taking 3 days off from this very thing I am doing right now, for example. And so on the other side is this other drive, which I would describe mostly as the fear drive, which is not from the book, but one could say maybe this is kind of derived from cortisol. So we have kind of the stress system on the one side, and then I am kind of running more on the cortisol side, whereas on the other side I'm running more on the dopamine side. Now this might be also an oversimplification, that one can run on both of these drives and be very stressed, and also maybe they have to in some way work together, because sometimes time constraints, for example, which might introduce more cortisol to the equation, or more of the cortisol or stress systems to the equation of the otherwise kind of free-flowing dopamine. I just do whatever I want and I just follow these ideas because they seem interesting. And so maybe a combination of those two seems to be also useful. But what seems to be not the most useful, but if I observe my behavior over the last weeks, months, in this case years, so as I was thinking about this, I thought about the last years. It seems to be the case that I can either drive for maybe weeks, or let's just say days to weeks, on the stress system, but I can also drive then on the dopamine system. And the nice thing about the dopamine system and running on it seems to be that my metrics, as measured, for example, by my watch, seem to not drop so much. So I actually am able to work out more. I'm actually progressing in terms of my workouts. And I also have all of these ideas which I would like to execute. So life kind of feels like it's actually kind of enjoyable. And I still get so many things done, at least compared to the very bad version of me that is just like, oh, I just don't want to do, and I also don't have any energy to, and also if I sleep, I cannot really sleep, and so on and so forth. So an accumulation of many different kind of bad aspects, or not very optimal aspects, one could say. And then on the cortisol side, one could also say this is a system that kind of runs, or is able to get things done, but then everything just feels like there is this dread that never will end. And yeah, well, that's kind of the other side, which seems also to be working quite well. But on this side, eventually I usually crash. So if I eventually crash, I now have also 1.5 years of Garmin data on this. My HRV, which currently, for example, is in the range of maybe 80 to 90 on a weekly average, but in these crashes, my HRV basically goes down. So HRV seems to be kind of a long-term indicator. My resting heart rate also seems to go up. So currently, as of the last sleep, for example, my resting heart rate was 39, which seems to be, so 35 to 40 seems to be kind of what very good athletes have. So at least on this very small point in time, I have something that is close to an athlete, whereas usually I don't. But what seems to be the case is that I drive too much on the cortisol side, on the stress side, that eventually my body just stops this in order to recover again. And the recovery takes quite a little bit of time until I'm kind of driven up again, and then I might be driven up by the cortisol side, but I might also be driven up by the dopamine side. And then life seems bright. I can go outside and look at the sun, for example, and it's like, it's so nice here. Whereas on the other side, it's like not so much, because also there seems to be something with light sensitivity, that if you're not well slept or well recovered, then light seems to be kind of too bright often. But in the end, it's probably just dopamine versus dopamine.